It was May 18, 2012, when a 17-year-old named Jonathan Hoffman called the emergency number. He said that his grandmother had shot him. I'm going to cry. The first question that comes up after that call is, what could have happened inside that house for such a tragic outcome? That's what the investigation needed to uncover, and I'll explain it in detail in today's episode. I'm Marcos Campos. Welcome, everyone. And this story takes place in West Bloomfield Township, Michigan, over in Uncle Sam's land. But first, I want to invite you, if you like criminal cases, to subscribe to the channel. There are episodes like this every week. If possible, become a member to directly support the channel. If you can't now, that's fine. Stay until the end and leave a like, comment, or emoji. It really helps. Deal made, messages sent. Let's get to the facts. This story is rather bizarre and raised many questions about the family issues of those involved. You know those hidden things that happen behind closed doors, that's right. When the police responded to the call for help from the boy who had been shot by his grandmother and arrived at the residence, they found a tragic scene. Jonathan Hoffman. The victim was lying face down, covered in his own blood, wearing shorts and athletic socks with several gunshot wounds. Still breathing, but his pulse was already very weak. And Sandra Lane, the 74-year-old shooter, she was still holding the gun, but soon she surrendered to the police and, without resisting, she declared, "I killed my grandson." The boy was rushed to the hospital, where he was declared dead on arrival. Meanwhile, on all 3 floors of that residence, there was a trail of blood, and the police recovered 10 bullet casings that had been fired at Jonathan. Shortly after the crime was discovered, and those first actions to help the victim and arrest the attacker, the young man's grandfather, Mr. Fred Lane, arrived at his own residence and was shocked by what had happened. Because think about it, he had left just a few minutes earlier because his wife, Mrs. Sandra, had asked him to do her the favor of taking the dog for a walk. And suddenly, when he comes back home, the place is a crime scene. His grandson is practically dead, and his wife is being taken out of the house straight to jail. In other words, Mr. Lane's world was turned upside down in the blink of an eye. Next, the police discovered that the teenager's parents were in Arizona, and they had left Jonathan in the care of his grandparents while he finished his last year of high school. But I'll explain more about why he was there in a moment. Jennifer Hoffman, the victim's mother, was clearly in total shock, and she stated the following: "No one would ever imagine a situation like this. Her parents, in this case, her own parents, killing their own grandson." Sandra Lane. Now let's talk a little about Mrs. Sandra Lane, the shooter. Actually, I need to correct a statement I just made. I said she went straight to jail when she left home, right? But that's not true. Because of her age, Mrs. Lane was taken to the hospital first for observation. And there in the emergency room, she told the police that Jonathan hadn't hurt her. So, as soon as she was discharged, she went straight to the police station. So, for the official procedures, the woman suddenly changed. She had a surprising reaction. She didn't want to continue the conversation with the investigators and asked them to call her lawyer, Dr. Jerry. Naturally then, with the legal superpowers in action, Sandra Lane changed her story to a self-defense version. Yeah, her account changed compared to the previous versions when she had simply shot Jonathan. So, she justified her actions now, claiming that she defended herself when there was some kind of disagreement between her and her grandson, which escalated physically. The teenager then allegedly resorted to physical violence. Jonathan had threatened the woman and even kicked her in the abdomen. The woman then, fearing for her own life, grabbed the weapon. Would this then be an authentic case of self-defense? According to Claro, she and her defense. However, the evidence was not on her side. Mrs. Lane showed no scratches, bruises, or any sign that indicated a physical struggle or violence suffered. So her stay at the hospital was nothing more than an observation due to emotional distress, which, let's be honest, is understandable. After she emptied a Pistols magazine into the boy, the teenager, who was her relative, her own grandson. Well, we weren't there. We didn't see the fight. Anyway, we're here sniffing around, I'd say, the scent of a lie. What do you think about this account of a frightened grandmother just defending herself? 2 days after the shooting, Mrs. Lane was officially indicted before the local district court and she was held without bail. That's because the police and the court doubted that claim of self-defense. Yeah, 74 years old and held without bail. The investigators did their job properly, looking closely at this whole story in detail down to the smallest details. Besides that, they also took a close look at the background of this family relationship. That way, they uncovered the background and managed to profile those involved. That's right, both of them and the victim. Sandra was not a gangster, Grandma, far from it. She was a retired teacher with no criminal record, and she didn't fit the profile of a cold-blooded killer. At 74 years old, she did volunteer work and took care of her grandson, who lived in her house. But we'll get to the problems between them soon enough, which seem to go beyond the usual generation gap. You'll see. In the same way that a plane doesn't crash just because of a single isolated failure, but rather due to a combination of factors that happen simultaneously, or maybe one after another. We think that a family tragedy of this magnitude with such violence can't have a single point of origin. Well, later you can tell me in the comments what you think. Highly dysfunctional family. Now let's listen to the statements from Jennifer, Mrs. Sandra's daughter, and the mother of the murdered teenager. Jennifer told the investigators the secrets about what she herself called a highly dysfunctional family. In fact, Jennifer's family described her mother as an argumentative, controlling, and physically abusive woman. Pretty complicated, isn't it? Those are really bad traits, and most of the time, they're present in toxic relationships, whether the domination is done by men or women. She said her father left home and never came back. Remember the story about the guy who goes out for cigarettes and vanishes? Yeah, that was the behavior of Jennifer's biological father, Sandra's first husband. Yeah. According to Jennifer, her father couldn't stand living with her mother, who was the one that turned that family's life into a real living hell. So he jumped out of the boat. He didn't. Here I feel sorry because poor daughter or children, they had nothing to do with this. However, as time passed, Sandra, despite her bad temper, remarried. With that, things even got better temporarily because Fred was a good guy, a good man, a good stepfather, and life went on. But when Jennifer, Sandra's daughter, got married and had children, the arguments at home started again. We can imagine a lot of things, can't we? A lot of people here, in fact, might even feel empathy for Jennifer and say they know what it's like to live with a difficult person, especially when that difficult person is your mother. She starts wanting to give too many opinions. And this obviously ruins any relationship that goes beyond the mother-daughter relationship because it becomes a tolerable coexistence and no longer a pleasant one. And even with the differences between mother and daughter, or mother-in-law and son-in-law, the grandchildren, Jonathan, who was shot, and Jessica, his little sister, loved their grandmother, in fact, their grandparents, and were very close to them. Well, in 2008, Jennifer separated from her husband, but it was a calm, civilized decision, and the whole family moved to Arizona to stay together. That is, Jennifer, her ex-husband, and their 2 children, Jonathan, who would be murdered 4 years later, and his sister, a little girl named Jessica. And it's at this point in the story that we get into those coincidences that are extremely sad in life. Unfortunately, Jessica, Jonathan's sister, and our main character fell ill with a brain tumor. Jennifer, the boy's mother, had to focus her life on her daughter's recovery. So she and her ex-husband agreed that Jonathan would live for a while with his grandmother Sandra and his grandfather Fred. And that's why he was there, at their house, at the time of the murder. Some time had passed then. After that, Jessica's health stabilized and Jennifer felt some relief, a sense of relief. she visited her son in Michigan at his grandmother Sandra's house. And look, folks, these are the links in a criminal chain, okay? Pay attention here, because nothing I'm about to tell you is random. When Jennifer got to her mother's house and reunited with her teenage son, she said he was happy, very happy, but he was smoking marijuana. In the mother's mind, the kid was just growing up, right? Knowing how things are, she ended up accepting it somewhat naturally, apparently without understanding the size of the problem that was forming. Which was, in fact, a powder keg inside the house with a fuse that wasn't very long, okay? And when Jonathan's death was being investigated, Jennifer came clean with the police. She reported the use of marijuana. But that wasn't all. The investigators discovered that at 17 years old, he was already building up a rap sheet with his various criminal records. Yeah, just look at that. For us, it was like water running downhill. The teenager had been stopped while driving, and it was found that he had marijuana. This became a police record, a case, and he was still on probation for that offense. When he got in trouble with the police again, this second time, they found that he had a controlled medication called Adderall. And that Adderall too, Midas appears on the internet as a brand name for a medication combination made up of 4 amphetamine salts. As everyone is noticing, right? The image of Jonathan Hoffman is being formed as a troubled teenager, whom his grandmother described as a child with anger issues. In fact, there was an incident weeks before his death where the grandson's behavior became so erratic that Sandra Lane called the police. So things happened, but we don't really know what. But the grandmother told investigators that her grandson's repeated bad actions finally led her to buy a gun for her own safety. He would kick doors and have fits of rage, and Sandra's lawyer, based on all of this, claimed that she was afraid of her grandson. Sandra Lane knew that Jonathan also used spice. The grandmother, who was Jonathan's legal guardian, spoke with the parole officer because she was afraid of the way he was acting. It's also worth knowing that it was in 1985 that an American scientist named John W. Hoffman isolated the cannabis molecule and created this so-called spice, or K2. This Dr. Hoffman was an emeritus professor of chemistry at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Originally, spice was developed as a pain medication, but it was never approved for clinical use. Of course, the substance ended up on the streets and became widely available as a synthetic marijuana, a drug that causes hallucinations, paranoia, anxiety, seizures, and death. Spice also causes additional health problems when it interacts with other medications or substances. So I guess Dr. Walter White probably didn't make that much money from his invention, but he did contribute to making the world a little worse than it already is. Anyway, guys, at Grandma Sandra Lane's house, things got really critical on May 18, 2012. As I mentioned, the teenage grandson was facing drug possession charges and had appeared in court that very day, accompanied by his elderly grandmother. The court ordered Jonathan to undergo tests that would detect any possible presence of drugs in his system. When they got home, the grandson allegedly argued with his grandmother, demanding money and car keys. Since the boy lost his life, part of the story depends on the shooter's account. She was obviously on that day very upset about having to deal with this mess with her grandson, who was clearly heading down the wrong path. And here we know that one thing leads to another, right? Maybe his friends were terrible, his school performance was bad, and the possibility of going to college was getting further away every day. Not to mention, because we don't know if he would be interested in continuing this criminal life and suddenly getting into drug dealing. This is just speculation. We can't know if that's true. But in the mind of his grandmother, Sandra, that was possibly the story. That was the movie playing in her mind at some point during the discussion. That day, over money and a car loan, the grandmother shot her grandson. The teenager was hit by 5 shots, 3 in the chest, 1 in the abdomen, and 1 in the arm. The police found blood on the floors and walls, and the victim lying on the floor. And also a 9mm pistol ammunition and a magazine. Everything was seized for examination, trial, and imprisonment. In March 2013, Sandra Laney's trial began. After the opening statements, the prosecution refuted her defense's argument that there was a life and death struggle between grandmother and grandson. Perhaps the most tense moment there was the repeated analysis of Jonathan's 911 call made at 5:27 in the afternoon when he said he had been shot. Almost 3 minutes later, he was shot again. During that time, the dispatcher heard Sandra's voice saying she would give Jonathan some water, and then more gunshots were heard. In other words, Sandra had 3 minutes to reflect on her actions before shooting the victim again. The defense argued that this happened because the teenager, even though he was injured, could still pose a threat to Sandra. It's impossible to know what really happened during that window of time between the first shot and the last. All I know is it's pretty surreal. The grandmother fires several shots, several rounds at her grandson. The grandson is wounded, manages to call emergency services, and asks for help. The grandmother and grandson continue talking. She says she's going to give him some water, and 3 minutes later, she finishes the job. Mrs. Sandra Lane definitely only stopped shooting when she ran out of ammunition. A month after the shooting, the autopsy confirmed Jonathan Hoffman died from multiple gunshot wounds. The report indicated 8 entry and exit wounds on Jonathan's body. A toxicology report shed new light on the case. When the tests proved that Jonathan was using synthetic marijuana called Spice or K2, as I mentioned earlier, however, Spice was in his urine. That means it wasn't actually affecting the boy at that moment. At least that's what was reported. And finally, in light of all this, the prosecutors ended up charging Sandra with illegal possession of a firearm, which is considered a serious crime. She was also charged with open homicide, which is a combination of first and second degree murder, in which the jury can determine the appropriate degree based on the evidence that will be presented. For us here on the channel, this open homicide charge is something new, don't you think? At least I don't remember presenting another case to you with this classification, right? Where the jury will figure out what actually happened. And then the proper weight is given, according to the law. The prosecution also emphasized that the defendant, Mrs. Sandra, did not show any visible signs of physical struggle, and that Sandra's instructions to her husband to leave the house with the dog demonstrated intent to kill. Here, a premeditated crime is much more serious than a crime of passion, right? Or self-defense, which happens in the heat of the moment. There, Grandpa Fred Lane, who was uninvolved, testified he didn't know his wife owned a gun. Maybe that was true, since that gun was a recent purchase by Sandra. Under questioning, Grandma made a pretty impressive statement about the moment of the crime. She said she grabbed the gun because she just wanted Jonathan to listen to what she was saying. Sandra wasn't afraid. She was asserting authority or trying to intimidate Jonathan. That's a very pedagogical way, isn't it? Finally, Sandra Lane was convicted for the murder of her grandson. That's right, found guilty of second-degree homicide. So she received a 20-year sentence for this crime and another 2 years for illegal possession of a firearm. In short, the jury didn't see a 74-year-old grandmother, they simply saw a murderer. She served about 12 years of that sentence in prison. However, according to records from the Michigan Department of Corrections, she was released in April 2024, although the reason for her early release was not disclosed. Given everything I've told you, there's a strange feeling left in the air, isn't there? The jurors and judge agreed it wasn't self-defense. For the American justice system, Sandra planned and carried out the murder of her grandson. He wasn't showing himself to be a good person, and she apparently decided to nip the problem in the bud. But of course, there are a lot of things there that leave, let's say, loose ends, right? After all, there's the mother's history, right? Jonathan's mother, daughter of Mrs. Sandra, who says she was a difficult woman, right? Controlling like that, reactive. So with her temperament, it's hard, right? To be sure about anything that happened there. Then, if you look at these details, like her saying she's going to get some water and a little while later shooting again, right? This boy had already been shot, supposedly, right? He was kind of immobilized. That's serious endurance, right? Taking a 9mm shot and still getting up. But I don't know either, since there's Jonathan's side too, right? He was already going through it, the teenager, not quite there yet, guys. And using that kind of drug, right? He already had a record with the police, facing charges in court. Who knows about his friends? It's a mess, isn't it? The parents were in another state. They left the kid at his grandparents' house. Of course, there was also the whole thing with his little sister, right? She had a tumor, and obviously they must have been going through a really tough time too. They believed that was the best choice then. I'm saying that this contributed to the crime, but we need to lay all the cards on the table here, right? To see how these links in the criminal chain began closing. Like I said, nothing about this crime seems random, right? Things start building up. Each little piece seems to converge there toward the final result. But you guys are excellent investigators. I want you to comment here for me what you think. Was it a crime of strong emotion, right? Self-defense? Or maybe even something in the heat of the moment, out of emotion? Jonathan may be answering back to his grandmother, and she, with that temper, couldn't control herself and crossed the line there, right? That stops normal people, let's say. Or was it in fact a premeditated crime? Did she tell her husband to go walk the dog, already planning to do that? Like when Jonathan picked up the phone, right? She was watching. Just think, I'm already reflecting with you all here. Think about it. She fired. He grabbed the phone and called emergency services. Then about 3 minutes passed. If she had murderous intent, she wouldn't have fired the other shots, right? The other 4 while he was trying to make the call, so she wouldn't create evidence against herself. Complicated, huh? Please leave your thoughts here in the comments because this case deserves a discussion. Deal. Thanks for your company. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.